Hello everybody, my name's Dr. Alison Nichols from Staffordshire Business School, and we're just waiting for a few people before we get started, but a warm welcome from me. And if you just want to hang on a second, and we'll start very shortly. So we've got a few people signing in early, and it looks like the numbers are creeping up now, so we'll just give it another minute or so if that's okay. Okay, it's just a few more people joining. An opportunity to get yourself a drink. Don't go too far though. Okay. All right. Okay. I'm going to get started if that's okay. As I said, a really warm welcome on this very sunny day and very warm day to the Wednesday Wisdom webinar. This is the last in the series that the university are hosting. As I mentioned, my name's Dr. Alison Nichols, and I'm Associate Professor of Business Management in the Business School in Staffordshire Business School. Okay. So I thought it would be useful just to start by giving you a little bit of background to the webinar and what we're going to cover today. Obviously, we're talking about leading emergent change, and it links to my teaching, my research, my writing, everything I do within the university, within the business school. And really the reason for this focus for the webinar today is because the COVID-19 crisis, which I'm sure we speak about it so much every day, but there's an opportunity for us to make sense of what that means for businesses, for organisations, most importantly in leading and managing that process, and for me specifically about managing that as an emergent type of change. So what we're going to do today is really try and make sense of that, and to do that I'm going to draw on two kind of areas of theory which I use a lot. One of them is around metaphor, so how we use images to make sense of things. And secondly, about discourse, and that's really just a posh word for saying how people talk about things, but it's a theoretical lens. So there's kind of two theoretical lenses that we're going to use today to try and make sense of what I see as an emergent change that's kind of bound up in the COVID-19 crisis. By my background, my professional background is in health and regeneration, and really that's what led me to looking at leadership and management as a topic of inquiry, but to do that specifically through lenses of practice, so what people say they do, because it's an area, a prominent and evolving area in leadership learning. And so all of my teaching, writing and research really focuses around leadership learning, and I use that specifically to support our senior leader learners on the higher degree apprenticeships and latterly those undertaking postgraduate research degrees to help them problematise and make sense of organisational life. We call it organisational life, and how decisions are made within that. So just by way of an introduction, I'm sure we've heard about the term change management, and it's heavily critiqued in the sense that, it's arguable whether we can manage all change, not least because there's a distinction that we can make between planned change, where we know when we look behind us, we can see the steps and the stages, and what we're talking about today, which is emergent change, which is where it's unplanned, it's largely chaotic. You look behind you and you cannot see where you've come from. And it's a bit like being in a wood. The further you get into the wood, you lose your orientation and you can't see where you've come from. And it's a particularly useful lens to think about the COVID crisis, not least because businesses are trying to work through the changes that have been presented to them throughout this unprecedented time. And really what that means is that they're trying to think about what a new normal means. It's brought threats to the commercial activity of businesses, but also to the health and social well-being in terms of the workforce. And so something that's particularly interested me in the COVID crisis is around how we sort of strike up a balance between the economy, meeting the needs of the economic needs of the business, but also the social side of things too. And it's an area of research that I'm currently undergoing right now. You can see in terms of my publication, something that's coming through very shortly. And what I'm asking here, if I'm problematising this, is, how should businesses be leading in these complex times when this is nothing but normal? And what I want to argue by the end of this time together is this understanding that it is possible to balance economy with society, but we need to think critically about the way that we lead. And a lot of the things that I'm involved in, a lot of the areas that I'm involved in teaching and research, is about critically reflecting on that. So really challenging our assumptions about what that means. Now, we're all used to seeing posts, media releases from the likes of McKinsey about how to manage, and they're always really helpful, to the point and on the button. And no surprise here that McKinsey come through in terms of talking about our need to lead and manage differently in times of crisis. They talk largely about shifting away from this notion of command and control, about empowering others, about sharing information, about challenging our natural instinct to take charge and control, where normally that would be the way forward. They're arguing that it's not what we need to do in times of crisis, and really promoting psychological safety. And what I really like to do when problematising these types of crises is really use what we call conceptual frameworks. So I'm going to use that as a way of understanding how to manage emergent change that is COVID. You'll see at the bottom of the screen a recent article that I wrote at the very beginning of the crisis. This was around drawing on my background in public health, which really started to spot how people were leading this crisis differently. And that's something that I want us to pick up on as we go through. And so what we see here is this, in the first kind of image, if you like, of how organisations are leading and managing. The first metaphor that we really want to turn to is the usual sense about everything being different, COVID being requiring a need to shift away from what we call command and control types of leadership. And we know that businesses really value this approach normally, not least because it allows us to target the efficient use of resources, to garner the workforce in terms of reducing costs, controlling costs, controlling the outputs in terms of people cost, really with a view to increasing productivity. And it's at the heart of these types of attempts to kind of command and control that's really well known in the public sector, where we focus on targets, we set a vision, whether that's through our own our own strategic vision or through the involvement of others. And the public sector have really been quite prominent in their approach to target setting, as we've seen through the delivery of services, really to try and increase productivity. But I think the concern here, and this is where metaphors come in, the concern is that approach, to what extent is that approach valid and useful in a crisis like COVID? And we know from past research in this kind of classical area that when it's overused, there tends to be a lack of focus on people. And so it starts to get us thinking about, okay, what's embedded in our assumption about command and control type leadership where a crisis is concerned? And if we know that it has a potential to have dehumanistic effects, you know, it begs the question, is that a useful approach to be using in times of COVID? And I ask you as really, in terms of the audience today, to critically reflect on on the images in your organisation. To what extent do you use that approach normally? And to what extent is it critical to retain, what's it necessary to retain critical oversight of in the times of COVID? Another image really that's very useful in terms of considering how we might lead in times of COVID is this image of organisations as machines. And again, it links back to the previous slide in terms of, you know, the public sector and private sector are very, very used to this type of delivery, machine-like organisations, business as usual, routines, repetitive tasks. But we have to think about businesses as not being the same in terms of public, private, third sector, and also universities. And so now we talk about businesses as having reference to a quadruple helix, in effect, for very different types of sectoral interests coming through. And it probably should start to create questions for us about, well, do all businesses need to handle things in the same way? In addition to that, we have to think about the process of a machine as an image for an organisation in terms of how it works, and to what extent is it possible to retain those types of approaches in times of COVID. Something that I've been talking to our senior leaders with a lot over the last 12 weeks of this crisis is this need to shift away from machine-like processes and practices towards one which incorporates notions of flux, and it's one that we'll look at as we go through. So again, I'd like you to critically reflect on the extent to which, knowing this, that if we think about this image, to what extent is our organisation reflective of that, and can we really rely on our usual ways of driving performance, knowing what we know from before about command and control, knowing that there might be some a limited focus on people, on the social aspects of that practice, and is that a relevant approach during this time? So the third tip, if you like, or trend in terms of leading and managing in emergent times is really this idea of transformational leadership. And the degree to which that is useful normally is rooted in notions of empowerment and relinquishing, granting authority, power to others, to your followers. So this is very much introducing the idea of leadership as followership. And it's very popular in businesses in normal circumstances. But how relevant is it again in times of COVID? What we need to consider here is the degree to which it's possible for you to be followed by your followers in terms of having all the answers in this time. And again, this is what flags up a concern really about bringing in other voices. So the consideration is here, how much can you afford to relinquish? Going back to the previous consideration about machine, is your organisation a machine? Are you commanding and controlling what happens? And how relevant is that at this time to grant authority to others in times of crisis, such as COVID-19 has brought along? One of the things that we know about transformational leadership is, whilst it's good for granting authority, it is still your point of view. And so hence my claim, empower, but remember, it's not all about you. And that's because approaches like this tend to be largely conformist. They don't tend to encourage reflection, actually, because it's very leader-centric, what we call leader-centric still. And therefore it prevents others from reflecting. And it's one of the aspects of leadership practice that when we use this type of discourse, we begin to see just how useful it is in different contexts. So the fourth tip in times of leading, in times of emergent change, is really about this need to promote psychological safety. And this is referenced to discourses or images of the leader as therapist. And this is by a scholar called Simon Weston, who himself was a nurse by background, and again has kind of come through this research and scholarly works to really critique what it is that leadership is about. And really getting into the idea of leadership as practice has been the only way we can make sense really of what people do to lead. And Weston says that in order to do this, we need to place a greater concern on the happiness, actually, and well-being of our workers. Now, this is an approach that's used in normal times, but it's especially important in times of emergent change. And that's because it enables the release, the safe release, I should argue, of concerns and worries and anxieties. And many of us in these times, depending on our kind of role in organisations, will have been providing more and more support like this. So we will have been acting as therapists. I'm sure you've thought yourself, I know I have, in my leadership of courses and programmes at the university. I've definitely adopted this kind of role, and it's an image because it's not a permanent thing, and that's the thing that we need to remember here when we talk about leadership as discourse. So this type of image of the leader is all about supporting personal growth. It's more than supporting personal growth. It's about offering support, and what it means for us in terms of the architecture or the structure that we need to put in place for the workforce, if we're bearing in mind this need to balance the commercial with the social purpose of business, we need to really set up architectural structures to enable people to share in that way. So this is all about establishing confidential structures, helplines, coaching, possibly mentoring. Coaching is different from mentoring. Coaching is more about a specific problem or issue that a worker might face, whereas mentoring is more about kind of coming up gradually to the next level and being supported in a peer type way by somebody that's already been there. And then there's something which you may be familiar with around action learning, which again is something that I've been involved in the public sector in my time in another university, where it's about bringing small groups of people together to learn together in a peer way, again, but facilitated by somebody who is outside of that group. And it's really a safe space. in which ideas, concerns, excuse me, anxieties can be shared, but it's very critically focusing on the issues in the workplace. And it leads us to our fifth kind of tip, if you like, about how can we lead and manage in times of change, emergent change such as COVID, using these metaphors, these images of organisational life, and also paying attention to what we need to do, to the practice of leaders and what we need to do in this particular type of context. And this brings me to Morgan's image, again, of organisations as flux. And the message here is just stop trying to control everything. And it's useful, it's really useful as an image of organisational life in times of change, of emergent change, because it reminds us that there are some contexts over which we have little, if any, control. And this is because within this, bound up within this image, is this idea of organisations being constantly facing turbulent change, constantly having to react to issues and problems and concerns from the external environment over which they have little control. This is a nice image for emergent change because it reminds us that as leaders and managers, or indeed as followers, that there's only so much we can do to manage that change. So it leads us to think about shaping, nudging, chipping away. And as we come to see in the next slide, that does generate conflict. It generates conflict because it involves nibbling away at other people's perceptions of how things should be. But going back to the very beginning, what I want to remind you of, this is about establishing, using your leadership as, or your practice as leadership as a process for creating a culture in which the standards are shared, and it acts like a reference point in these otherwise chaotic times. And so the manager's role here, leaders or managers, and you'll note I'm using those interchangeably because it's just a language nowadays. Leadership and management are ostensibly used to refer to the same type of practice, although it meant different things in the past. And so leaders and managers need to act here as enablers of others to help provide a forum for the exchange of different views. And those views may be significantly different. And this brings me to my sixth point, really, around how to lead and manage organisational change in times of emergent chaotic change like COVID. And it's really where we can begin to see that perhaps our usual organisational culture, this is very, very common in a lot of organisations. And again, going back to the work I've done previously in my role as practitioner, but also as scholar of leadership learning and the facilitation and the teaching and learning that I'm involved in, this is very, very common in organisations where, in order to get things done, it's not what you know, but who you know. And it obviously brings forth this idea of competing interests, which I mentioned before. What this tells us is that it's quite common, it's quite normal for organisations to act as sources of places of conflict. And it acts in that way because of what we call dissensus, a posh word for difference. Consensus is the same, dissensus is different. As the dissensus really brings to the fore the need sometimes in organisations and in life in general to form coalitions, to form cabals or clans, to make us feel safe, to see things from to share the same view. So it's what I was talking about this morning with my senior leaders, we call homogeneity. So it's sameness. And it's really about This need in organisations to feel as though you've got people on your side. So an homogenous view is normal in political organisations, because that's what forms the cabals. Except there's a problem there. Why, you ask? Because organisations comprise of diversity of people who have diverse and different interests. And this, if I'm honest, is the start of contemporary views of leadership and change, which brings us to a point at which we have to start thinking about how to manage difference. And emergent change is really at the heart of the need to generate different types of leadership because of that difference. And we have to be careful here because of stopping them from being winners and losers. So again, you know, what does this tell us in times of COVID? We need to accept conflict as inevitable, but our usual way of organising organisational life may not apply. This leads us to the last real focus in terms of where the contemporary models of leadership and management are taking us, and it's to something called the eco-leader. It's Simon Weston again. And it's where we recognising difference and recognising flux and recognising that the change is inevitable, it's going to be all around us. The only way really that we can manage that is through dissensus, is through being aware of dissensus, constant dissensus. And that's because we have political, environmental trends that are that are constantly beating at our door. We have different stakeholders, we have different competitors, and we're all interdependent. And so Weston suggests that eco-leadership is the way forward for making sense of and managing the constant interaction that comes, the interdependence between leaders and followers, and it brings with it what we call a distributed view of leadership. And this is where we talk about handing the baton of leadership over. So it's kind of relinquishing control. And what we're saying is that that's not appropriate always, but sometimes it is appropriate. And so what we've seen in times of COVID is this relinquishing, not granting, not gifting authority, where you see it, but actually allowing others to take the lead for things that you just have not got the time to take responsibility for. And so the consideration here is, in times of COVID, how helpful is this type of culture? And leaders tell us in these times that the usual way of doing this is not, this isn't present in usual times, but it really should be in order to move forward to think about emergent change. So what I'd like to end with really is this image, this renewed, reconceptualized, rethought image of organisations as organisms. That's in the sense of the metaphor of there being constant evolvement, constant evolution from one state into another. It takes us back to that earlier point about when you're in the wood and you look behind you and you can't see where you've come from. This view really accepts that the environments within organisations are evolving constantly, and so we need to think about thinking ahead, readiness to change. Many of you will have heard talk about readiness for change, and this is where it sits within metaphors and discourses of leadership. And it's really key to helping us, as we saw earlier, to put in place longer term structures, architecture, if you like, to support the things that people are going to need to be in that constant state of flux. One of the things that that really intrigued me was this discussion with some of my senior leaders about the need to shift originally from machine and maybe even going back to that, but being in a state of flux in the middle. And this is where you should look to end up. Okay, perhaps you don't need to go back to a machine-like operation in your business. Perhaps you can move towards this more evolutionary image of change in your organisation. And so finally, I'm aware of time. Finally, what I'd like to finish on in terms of a summary is our need to consider organisations as metaphors when we're thinking about change, when we're thinking about how we can move forward. And what we're saying is that since emergent change involves so many different stakeholders, individuals, teams, whole organisations, what we need really in place is an architecture for understanding, that should say fully, not Philly, what works. I'm arguing that discourse really matters, because the usual take on leadership, which is around leadership is who you are, your traits, your character, versus the skills that you have, the behaviours that you use. Leadership as a process is really more useful for all types of change. Why? Because it allows this focus on not just the leader as a leader-centric person, individual, with their views and thoughts and values, but also takes into account the follower, so it's leaders and followers. And most importantly, it takes into account the context, the places, the spaces, the time the changing times that leadership takes place in. And so we see the contribution of Morgan, of Maybe, of Weston, as not so contemporary, but very relevant. We're talking 10, 12 years ago that these theories came out, but they really are coming to the fore. They're coming into their own right now with the likes of COVID, because they allow us to see to see quite clearly and reveal the hidden assumptions that are bound up in our organisational structures. With that being that, we do often operate as machines in organisations. We do often lead through command and control. But there are consequences to doing so, consequences to the social purpose of our organisations, which when we think about inequality, tackling inequality in organisations and in society, maybe we need to think about how we can bring the humanness back into those processes. And what these images of leadership and change afford us is an opportunity to do that, really by rethinking the architecture, the structures, the readiness that we need to create in organisations to cope with crises like COVID in the future. This is where I'm going to finish, really, but this idea of practice, we can only really understand and explain and even explore what leadership is about through this notion of practice. And we can theorise that through this idea of metaphor, albeit socially constructed, but it's still a metaphor, it's still useful. And the skills that we need, the tools that we need, and this is what I'm always encouraging our senior leaders and our military leaders who I teach throughout the year, is to have this toolkit of mechanisms available to them so that they can choose what they need to use at different times and spaces. And we can only really do that by understanding how they talk about leadership through their practice. Okay, I'm going to finish there, and I'm going to leave you with some critical reflections, which again, this is something that we do, is at the heart of a lot of the teaching and learning, all of the teaching and learning that we do at postgraduate, taught and also research level. And that's really to challenge your assumptions by reflecting on what view of organisational life is most prevalent in your business, do you think, normally? And then to think about which view of leadership practice is normally operating. What's your preference? What tends to happen where you are in terms of the culture that's inculcated where you operate normally? And then finally, compare that with to what extent has this had to shift during the COVID-19 crisis? And what does that tell you about what's needed now in managing this emergent change? But most importantly, what can you retain and harness going forward as we move back to a new normal post the COVID crisis? Thank you very much, and I'd be really happy to take questions now on through the chat function. Sure, thank you. So we've got a question: how can we ensure that we don't hand over leadership responsibility to wrong person or people? That's a really crucial question, and I think it takes us back to your skill. Really, we make a distinct your skill as the leader with responsibility. You have to make that decision. How much can you afford to relinquish control? But it's to do with the context. Can you, if you're thinking about operating in your image of organisations as machines, is it really necessary for you to retain oversight over everything that happens in that time of crisis? And the answer is no. And most of the ad hoc, and I will be writing this up as we, in time, through papers and also through research. But as we go through, what we're beginning to see is that it hasn't been possible for businesses to retain control over everything. And a lot of my senior leaders have been telling me that they've had to relinquish control. They were forced to actually at the beginning of the crisis, and then maybe taking some of that back. But that is, if you've got the hat and the badge, if you're the responsible leader in an organisation, it's your decision about how that happens and where that goes. As the organisation evolves and as trust builds, it becomes more apparent where that can be handed over. Does that answer your question? Have we got any other questions? Okay. Okay, so unless we've got any more questions, I'm going to extend a really huge gratitude to you for taking the time to spend with me this afternoon on what is a very warm day, and and to spend it with me. I'm pleased that you've chosen that rather than the warm weather. But can I thank you very much for taking the time, and I'll end it there. But thank you very much.